My name is Danny Whitmore. I'm 34 years old, and on a Sunday afternoon in April, at my mother's kitchen table, surrounded by the 11 people who love me most and have believed in me least for the past 2 years, my phone rang. I had been sitting at that table for 4 hours. 4 hours of Easter dinner and polite conversation and the particular low-grade discomfort of being the person in the room everyone is quietly worried about, and no one knows how to talk to directly. My Aunt Carol had already asked me twice whether I had looked into administrative work. My cousin Tyler had mentioned, not for the first time, that his company was hiring and that he could put in a word if I needed something stable. My mother had refilled my plate without asking, the way she does when she doesn't know how to help, but needs to feel like she's helping. My father sat at the head of the table and said almost nothing, which was its own kind of communication, because my father only goes quiet when he doesn't trust himself to say the right thing. I had been back in my hometown of Dayton, Ohio for 14 months. I had moved back after losing my job as a features editor at a national magazine in New York, one of those mass layoffs that gets written up in the media industry press. The kind where they announce it on a Tuesday and you have your things in a box by Thursday. I had moved back because my savings had a specific number, and New York had a specific cost, and the math was not kind, and because there was a guest room in my parents' house and my mother had offered it before I had to ask. I had moved back because I was 32 years old, and I had watched the thing I had spent a decade building get eliminated in a restructuring meeting, and I needed somewhere to land. My family, watching me land, had formed a conclusion. It was not an unkind conclusion. It was the conclusion of people who loved me and who understood the world in terms of visible, measurable things. Job titles, office addresses, salary ranges. They could reference in conversation, and what they saw when they looked at me was someone who had lost all of those things. They saw someone who woke up in the room she had slept in at 17, who drove the same road she had driven in high school, who was trying to explain what she was working on in terms that kept not quite landing with people who needed to see a business card to believe the answer was real. They thought I had nothing left. That Sunday, with the table full and the ham getting cold and Tyler waiting for my answer about the job lead, my phone rang. I looked at the screen. I knew what call this was. I had been waiting for it for 11 days, and I had told myself when it came I would step outside to take it, walk to the end of the driveway, keep it private, process it alone before I said anything to anyone. That was the plan. I looked at the screen. I looked at my family around the table, and something shifted. Not anger, not performance. Something quieter than both of those. Something that felt like the end of a long patience. I accepted the call. I set the phone on the table, and I said, I'm going to put this on speaker, if everyone is okay with that. Nobody said they weren't. Before I tell you what was said in that kitchen, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe only if this story is already reaching something in you. Drop your city and local time in the comments. I love knowing who is there. Now let me take you back, because you need to understand who I was before the layoff, to understand what the layoff actually cost, and what I built in its aftermath, to understand what was said on that phone call. The kitchen table is the end of the story. Let me give you the beginning, which starts in Dayton, in a house on a street with a sidewalk that buckled every winter, with a family that wanted everything good for me and never quite understood what good looked like when it arrived. My parents, Robert and Cheryl Whitmore, are people of specific and genuine dignity, and I want to draw them carefully because easy caricature would be a disservice to what they actually are. My father drove a delivery route for a regional grocery distributor for 29 years. The same company, the same route for most of those years, the same alarm at 4:45 in the morning 6 days a week, and he retired with the same work ethic intact. A man who had organized his entire understanding of a well-lived life around showing up on time and doing what you said you would do, and never requiring other people to carry what you could carry yourself. He is not a complicated man in the way that people sometimes use that phrase as a compliment for depth. He's a straightforward man, which is its own kind of depth when it is maintained without compromise over decades. My mother worked as a medical office receptionist for 18 years at a practice on the west side of Dayton, managed a household on a budget that required genuine management rather than the comfortable approximation of it, and raised 2 children with the consistent, unhurried warmth of someone who had decided a long time ago that love was a practice and not only a feeling, that it showed up in the meal on the table and the permission slip signed before it was asked for and the specific way she listened when you talked, which was completely without her attention going anywhere else. They were not people who talked about books at dinner or followed media industry news or understood in any operational sense what a features editor at a national magazine actually spent her Tuesdays doing. What they understood was that I had gotten a scholarship to a college in Columbus, that I had moved to New York after graduation and gotten a job at a publication they had heard of, that the job paid enough to sustain a life in a city that was known to be expensive, and that I seemed, in the 12 years between that graduation and the layoff, to be doing the thing I had gone there to do. That was sufficient for them. They were proud in the way that good parents are proud, when they don't fully understand what's been built but can see clearly that it's standing. My extended family was a different kind of audience. My father's sister, Carol, was the family's appointed expert on what success looked like and whether any given person had achieved it. Not from cruelty. Carol was not a cruel woman, but from a genuine belief that she understood the shape of a good life and that part of loving people was steering them toward it. She had opinions about careers and stability and the specific kind of security that came from working for an organization large enough to have a human resources department. She had expressed doubts about journalism as a profession from the time I first mentioned it, had tracked my career from a distance with the careful attention of someone waiting to see whether they were right to be skeptical, and had recalibrated periodically when evidence seemed to require it. My cousin Tyler, Carol's son, was 38 and worked in logistics management, owned a house, drove a truck that was 4 years old and paid off, and had the settled, untroubled manner of a person whose life had matched the blueprint they had been handed, and who could not entirely understand why. Anyone's wouldn't. He was not dismissive of me. He was genuinely puzzled by me, which in some ways was harder. Puzzlement has no edges to push against. Marcus, my brother, was the more complicated one. He had stayed in Dayton, built a small contracting business with a partner, gotten married, had 2 kids. He did not fully understand my world either, but he had the specific loyalty of a brother who had grown up in the same house and who, regardless of comprehension, was on my side in the way that mattered not in every conversation, but in every crisis. He was the one who had called me the week after the layoff and said, "What do you actually need?" Not the polite version. I had told him. He had helped. "I want to draw this family for you carefully because I do not want to make them the villains of this story, and I will not, because they are not. They are people who loved me with the tools they had, which were real tools even when they were the wrong shape for what I needed. The thing that was hard about coming home was not their love. It was the specific, inadvertent diminishment that came from being seen through a lens that had never been quite right for me, by people who were too close and too invested to understand that the lens was off. The layoff happened on a Tuesday in February, 2 years and 3 months before that Easter Sunday. I had been at the magazine for 6 years, the last 3 as a features editor, overseeing a team of writers, assigning and editing long-form pieces, building the specific kind of institutional knowledge that takes years to accumulate and that vanishes entirely from the record the moment the HR email arrives. The restructuring eliminated 7 editorial positions across 2 departments. Mine was one of them. The announcement came in an all-staff meeting that had been called with 45 minutes notice, which is always the sign in any workplace that has done this before. The short-notice all-hands meeting has only one possible agenda item. I remember the specific quality of the silence in the room after the announcement was made. Not shocked silence. Nobody in media in that period was genuinely shocked by a restructuring. More like the silence of people recalculating. Who is affected? What comes next? Whether the logic of the cuts makes sense or whether it is the kind of arbitrary logic that restructurings sometimes produce, where the people who survive are not necessarily the people who should have. I sat in that silence and felt the ground shift under 12 years of work. I had my things in a box by Thursday afternoon. The weeks that followed went the way those weeks go badly, and then less badly, and then in a direction that doesn't have a name because it is neither recovery nor continuation, but something more like reorientation. I applied for positions at other publications. I spoke to editors I had worked with over the years, people who respected my work and said so and were not, in that particular moment, in a position to hire. I freelanced. I took assignments from outlets that paid less than I was used to, but that kept my byline active and my skills in use. I did the things you are supposed to do when a career is disrupted, and the things you are supposed to do or not producing the next version of the career with any of the speed or clarity the situation required. The city did not help. New York is a place that responds to momentum. When you have it, the city amplifies it. When you lose it, the city keeps moving at the same speed it always does, and you stand in it understanding, at a cellular level, that nothing around you has slowed down to accommodate your circumstances. I had loved New York for 12 years. In the months after the layoff, I was aware of it, the way you are aware of a weather system large, constant, indifferent. After 7 months on savings that were declining, with the specific, merciless arithmetic of fixed costs against reduced income, I called my mother on a Wednesday evening. I sat on the edge of my bed in my Brooklyn apartment and told her I was thinking about coming home for a while. She said come without pause or qualification, in the particular voice she uses when she has already decided something and is waiting for you to catch up to the decision. I knew what it would cost. Not financially, she would not have asked for anything but in the other currency, the one made of how you are seen and what conclusions people draw and what version of yourself you have to sit inside when you return to a place that knew you before you became who you chose to be. I came anyway because the alternative was watching the savings account reach a number that would require decisions I was not ready to make. And because I had learned enough by 32 to know that pride is a luxury you can't always afford when the math stops working. I drove to Dayton in early December with my car packed to a level that required me to rely on the passenger side mirror for lane changes. I moved into the guest room of the house I had grown up in. I hung my work clothes in the closet next to a box of high school things my mother had never gotten around to moving to the garage. I set up my laptop on the desk that had been mine at 17, and I sat down at it on the first morning, and I looked at the room, the same ceiling, the same window, the same view of the neighbor's oak tree, and I understood, with the full clarity that only certain threshold moments provide, that something about this situation was either going to break me or was going to produce something I could not yet see. I chose, deliberately and with eyes open, to treat it as the second thing. Not from optimism, I am not a naturally optimistic person, and I do not trust optimism as a strategy. From stubbornness, and from the particular quality of attention that certain kinds of loss give you when you stop fighting the reality of them and begin instead to work inside what they have made possible. Loss clears space. Not gently, but space is space. And what you fill it with is still yours to decide. The book had been in my head for 3 years before the layoff, not as a plan, not as something I was actively working toward in any organized or intentional way, more like a shape I kept catching in my peripheral vision, something I sensed was there but kept not turning to look at directly. Because looking at it directly meant admitting I wanted it, and wanting it meant the possibility of not getting it. And I was 30 years old with a career that was still building, and I did not have the room, emotionally or practically, to want something that large and that uncertain alongside everything else I was managing. It was a memoir about growing up in Dayton, about the specific texture of a working-class Midwestern childhood in a family that had everything necessary and nothing extra, about what it had cost me to leave, and what it had cost the people I left to watch me go, and what it meant to spend 12 years building a life in a city that had no category for you in its default operating system. About my grandmother on my father's side. Grandma Ida, who had come from rural Georgia at 19 with 2 suitcases and no contacts, and who had built something in Dayton that lasted and mattered through a combination of will and clarity and a specific, unshakable refusal to accept other people's definitions of what she was allowed to want. About the distance between the person you become when you leave a place and the person that place still expects you to be when you return to it. About what class does to ambition and what ambition does to class loyalty, and whether you can hold both of those things at once without one of them swallowing the other. I had been making notes for 3 years, fragments of scenes, early morning voice memos, paragraphs I typed quickly into documents and then left open for weeks without returning to them. Half-formed arguments about geography and belonging that I had been having in my own head since I was 22, and that I did not yet know how to make into something a reader could hold. What I had not done was sit down fully, without an escape route, without the magazine to return to, and the deadline to protect me from the open space of an unfinished thing, and turn the fragments into a draft. The guest room gave me that. Not immediately, and not easily. The first month in Dayton was largely about adjustment, the specific, disorienting strangeness of being 32 years old in the house where you grew up, of navigating a space that was organized around other people's rhythms and routines, of learning to work in a room that was not yours in any of the ways a room needs to be yours for serious work to happen in it. But December turned into January, and January turned into February. And somewhere in the middle of that stretch, I began to find the hours. Early mornings before my parents came downstairs, and the particular stillness of a house that is still mostly asleep and that belongs, in that hour, to whoever is willing to be up in it. Afternoons when the house emptied, and the quiet was not the quiet of constraint, but the quiet of space. Evenings after dinner when I excused myself with a vague reference to something I was working on which was true, and which my parents received with the mild trusting and curiosity of people who had decided to give me room, and went back to the desk and opened the document and worked. I wrote the way I had learned to edit, with specificity, without sentiment, with the trained eye for what was necessary and what was decorative and what was absent and needed to be there. I wrote scenes from my childhood with the same care I had applied for 6 years to other people's work. I wrote about Grandma Ida in the language she deserved, which is the language of full attention and precise detail, because she had given me a blueprint and I owed her the accuracy. I wrote about leaving Dayton and about arriving in New York, and about the layoff and about the guest room itself, which was both the subject and the location of the writing. A recursion I found oddly useful. I wrote about the particular loneliness of being genuinely loved by people who cannot quite see you, which is different from being unloved and in some ways harder to name. By March, 3 months after arriving, 14 months before Easter Sunday, I had 140 pages of a first draft. I sent 20 of them to Constance, a writer who had been a mentor since my early years at the magazine and whose judgment I trusted more than almost anyone's. She called me 2 days later. She said, "This is the best writing you have ever done." She said, "I need you to finish this." And then she said the thing I had not yet allowed myself to say aloud. "Have you thought seriously about finding an agent?" I had thought about it the way you think about things you want badly enough to be frightened of them. Constance gave me 3 names, agents who handled narrative nonfiction, whose client lists represented the kind of work I was trying to do. I spent 2 weeks on the query, the sample pages, the synopsis, the letter that had to be both specific and open, that had to communicate what the book was and why it mattered without reducing it to a pitch. I sent it to all 3 on a Wednesday morning, and then closed my laptop and walked around the block twice and came back and kept writing, because waiting actively is something I have never been able to do without the work to steady me. 2 of them passed within a week. The third, a woman named Rosalind Park, who had represented some of the narrative nonfiction I most admired and whose client list I had studied with the attention of a student reviewing a syllabus they know they will be tested on, wrote back 9 days after I sent the query asking for the full manuscripted. I sent it on a Friday afternoon. I did not tell anyone. Not my parents, not Marcus, not Constance, not the few friends who had been through the layoff with me and who I knew would have wanted to celebrate the submission, just to have something good to hold. I was not ready to carry anyone else's hope alongside my own. I was managing my own hope carefully enough that adding more weight felt genuinely dangerous. That was 11 days before Easter Sunday. Rosalind called on Easter Sunday at 2:47 in the afternoon. I need to tell you what the table looked like at that moment, because the table is everything in this part of the story. 11 people. My parents at either end. Marcus and his wife Keisha and their 2 kids, who had been excused to the living room with tablets after dessert. My Aunt Carol and her husband Don. Tyler and his girlfriend Megan, who I liked and who seemed slightly bewildered by the family dynamics and the specific way of people who are new to a room and are still trying to map it. My mother's sister, Aunt Bev, who had driven from Columbus and who was the warmest person in my family and had not once since I came home said anything about the job situation other than to squeeze my hand and say, "I know you're going to be fine." And I had believed her. And it had mattered more than she knew and me. In the chair I had sat in at every holiday dinner since I was old enough to sit at the adult table, with a plate in front of me that I had barely touched because my stomach had been a knot for 11 days and food was not a priority. Listening to Tyler explain a staffing situation at his company, registering the moment he pivoted toward me with the offer, already forming the polite deflection I had ready for exactly this situation. My phone buzzed. I looked at the screen. Rosalind Park, a name I had been looking at in my contacts for 11 days like it was a closed door I was waiting to see open. The deflection I had prepared for Tyler dissolved completely. I looked at the phone. I looked at the table, and I thought about the version of this moment I had planned: the driveway, the privacy, the processing alone, and I thought about 4 hours of being quietly worried about, of job leads offered with the gentle condescension of people who have decided, "You need rescuing," of my father's particular silence and my mother's refilled plate, and the version of me that this room had been carrying in its head for 14 months, diminished and stalled and running out of road. I thought about my grandmother, who had come to a new city with 2 suitcases and no contacts and who had not waited for permission. I accepted the call. I set the phone face up on the table. I said evenly and without drama, "I'm going to put this on speaker, if everyone is okay with that." The table went quiet. Nobody objected. 11 people looked at me. Rosalind's voice came through the speaker clearly. She said my name. She said, "I finished it last night. I want to represent this book." And then she said, and I want to give you the exact shape of what she said, because I have played it back in my memory more times than I can count. She said, "Danny, this manuscript is extraordinary. I have been in this business for 19 years, and I can count on one hand the number of times I have read something and known immediately that it was going to find its readers. This is one of those times. I want to submit it to publishers this month. I think we are going to get a very strong response." The kitchen was silent. Completely silent, in the way that rooms only go silent when something has shifted so entirely that the air itself needs a moment. My mother's hand went to her mouth. My father, who had been quiet for 4 hours, set down his fork with the slow deliberateness of a man who is processing something and needs his hands freed to do it. Tyler, to his credit, did not speak. Aunt Bev made a sound that was not quite a word. It was the sound of someone being proven right about something they had hoped for without being able to explain the hoping. I said into the phone, my voice steady in a way that surprised me, "I'd like that very much, Rosalind. Let's do it." We made an arrangement to speak in full on Monday. I thanked her. She said she was excited, and it sounded like she meant it in the specific way that professionals mean it when the excitement is real and not performed. I ended the call. I picked up my phone. I set it beside my plate, and then I looked at my family. Marcus spoke first. He said, "Danny, what was that?" Not unkindly. He just needed the translation because he had not been inside the context. I said, "I've been writing a book. Since I came home, I finished a draft and sent it to a literary agent 3 weeks ago. That was her. She wants to represent it." My mother took a breath that was audible across the table. She said my name once, just my name, in the specific voice that mothers use when they are feeling something too large and too sudden to contain in ordinary language. My father looked at me for a long moment. His expression was not the expression of a man learning something new about his daughter. It was the expression of a man recognizing something he had always suspected was true, but had not known how to name. He said, "How long have you been working on it?" I told him about the 3 years of notes before the layoff, about the 140 pages in the guest room, about Constance and the query letters and the 11 days of waiting. He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "You were doing this the whole time you were here?" "Yes," I said. He nodded once, slowly, the nod of a man who has spent 29 years showing up on time and doing the thing he said he would do, recognizing that quality in someone else, and understanding, perhaps for the first time with full clarity, that he had seen it in his daughter all along and had simply not known the name of the thing he was watching. Carol, my aunt, was the one I had been most braced for. She had offered the most practical concern over the previous 14 months. The administrative work, the stability, the idea that what I needed was an organization large enough to have a human resources department. She looked at me across the table. She said carefully, as if she was placing each word down deliberately, "A book. A real publisher." I said, "That's what we're hoping for, yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something I genuinely had not expected. She said, "I didn't understand what you were doing." She said it plainly, without deflection. "I thought you were struggling. I was watching for struggle and I didn't see anything else." That is the most honest thing Carol has ever said to me in my adult life. I received it fully. Tyler, to his credit, said only, "That's huge, Danny." And then nothing else, which was exactly the right amount. My mother reached across the table and took my hand. She held it without saying anything for a while. When she spoke, she said, "I knew something was happening in that room. You'd come out for dinner, and there was something on your face. I didn't know what I was looking at." She squeezed my hand. "Now I know." Rosalind submitted the manuscript to editors at 11 publishing houses in the 3rd week of May. I did not watch the inbox obsessively. I went back to other work freelance pieces. A short essay I had been asked to write for a literary journal. The daily maintenance of a professional life that was still reconstructing itself around new parameters. I had learned, over years of working in an industry that ran on pitches and rejections and the long waits between them, that the watching did not change the outcome and only changed you in ways that were not useful. By the end of the 1st week of June, Rosalind had received 4 offers. 4 publishers had read the manuscript and wanted it. I sat in the guest room on a Tuesday afternoon with my phone against my ear while she walked me through the details of each offer. The houses, the editors, the terms, the specific kinds of support each publisher was describing, and I listened with the particular quality of focused calm that I recognize in myself in the moments when something large is happening and I need to be fully present for it, rather than inside my own reaction to it. The book sold to a major publisher in New York, one of the imprints I had grown up reading. One that had published writers I had come to this work wanting to be for an advance that was more than I had earned in any single year of my career at the magazine. I was in the guest room when Rosalind called with the final confirmed number. My parents were downstairs. I sat for a few minutes after the call ended, with the phone in my lap and the familiar view of the neighbor's oak tree outside the window. And I thought about Grandma Ida coming to Dayton at 19 with 2 suitcases and no contacts and building something anyway. And I felt the specific, full weight of what she had handed me by example. Then I went downstairs and told my parents. My father sat at the kitchen table when I said the number. He pressed both hands flat against the table surface and breathed for a long moment. Then he said, "Your grandmother would have had something to say about this." He said it with a smile I had not seen on his face in quite that particular way before, the smile of a man who has been holding something close for a long time and has finally been given permission to feel its full size. I sat down across from him. We talked about Grandma Ida for nearly an hour. It was the longest conversation my father and I had ever had. And it was not about the book. It was about her, about what she had been, about what he remembered, about what he believed she had passed to me that he himself was still trying to understand how to name. I do not think either of us knew we needed that conversation until we were in the middle of it. The book comes out in 9 months. The title is the same one I typed at the top of the first page of the first draft in December, on the desk at 17, in the house on the street with the buckled sidewalk, the two-suitcase city. It is about my grandmother and Dayton and New York, and the particular geography of ambition, what it costs to leave and what it costs to stay, and what it does to you over time to live at the distance between who you had to become and who the place you came from still expects you to be. It is the truest thing I have written in my career, and I wrote it in a guest room in 14 months when my family believed I had nothing left. What I actually had was the time and the desk, and a blueprint from a woman who had crossed a country with 2 suitcases and shown me, by the way she lived, that you build from exactly where you are with exactly what you have. That is what I did. That is all anyone does when what they're building is real. I want to be honest with you about something before I close this, because I think honesty is the only reason to tell a story like this one. And because the honest version of this story is more useful to anyone sitting inside a version of it than the clean version would be. The moment at the Easter table, the phone on speaker, the room going quiet, my Aunt Carol saying I didn't understand what you were doing. I do not want to frame that as a triumph over people who failed me. That framing is available, and it would make a certain kind of story, but it would not be a true one. The true one is more complicated and more tender than that, and it requires me to say some things about my own choices that are not entirely flattering. My family thought I had nothing left because I had not shown them what I was building. That was my choice, made for reasons that were real and that I understood and that I stand behind, in the sense that I believe I would make them again in the same circumstances. The fragility of an unfinished manuscript, the specific and considerable vulnerability of wanting something that large and not yet knowing whether you were going to get it, the learned caution of a person who had spent years having the important things she cared about received with a kind of meaning and comprehension that was its own form of diminishment. I had learned to keep certain things sealed. I applied that habit here. I do not fully regret it. The privacy of those 14 months, the early mornings at the desk, the evenings with the document open, the particular quality of work that happens when no one is watching and no one is hoping on your behalf yet, and it is just you and the thing you are trying to make. That privacy had value. It allowed the book to become what it became without the interference of other people's expectations, which have a way of reshaping things before they are ready to be shaped. But I also want to say honestly that privacy maintained past its useful point creates its own damage. When you keep the building hidden, the people who love you fill the hidden space with whatever their imagination provides, and their imagination will usually default to what they can observe, which was the guest room, and the freelance pieces, and the unanswered job lead, and the refilled plate, and my father's particular quiet at the head of the table. They were not wrong to worry. They were working with incomplete information because I had chosen to keep the information incomplete. And they did the only thing people can do with incomplete information, which is construct the most plausible story from the available evidence. The available evidence said struggling, so that is the story they carried. The phone on the table was not a correction of their judgment. It was an end to the incompleteness. And I could have ended the incompleteness sooner, in smaller ways, Without waiting for the Rosalind Park call, I could have said, at any point in 14 months, I'm working on something. I don't know yet what it will become, but it is real, and I am giving it everything. That sentence would have been true from the first week of January. I never said it. I think about why. I think the truest answer is that saying it out loud would have made it real in a way that required me to account for it if it failed, and I could not afford that exposure. The book could fail privately. It could be rejected privately. I could grieve it privately and recalibrate and move forward, and no one in that kitchen would have known to be disappointed on my behalf. Saying it out loud removed that option, and so I said nothing, and they assumed the worst. And I sat for 14 months in a room while people I loved carried a version of me that was not accurate, because accuracy felt too expensive to offer. I am not sure that was right. I think about my father at the head of the table in those 4 hours, quiet in the way he goes, quiet when he doesn't trust himself to say the right thing. And I wonder what he was carrying in that silence, what the cost of it was, whether a single sentence from me early on might have changed the texture of those months for both of us. I cannot know, but I think about it. What I know is this: the guest room did not break me. The layoff, which felt at the time like the end of the version of my life I had been building for 12 years, was not the end. It was the disruption that cleared enough space for the thing I had been circling for 3 years to finally become possible. I have said this to people since, and it sounds like something printed on a motivational graphic, and I am aware of that. And I am saying it anyway because it is true, and true things do not stop being true because they have been said imprecisely by other people in other contexts. The room I was in was not a room with nothing in it. It was a room with a laptop and a desk, and 140 pages, and a grandmother who had crossed a country with 2 suitcases and no contacts, and who had handed me, somewhere in the language of her life, a blueprint for what it looked like to build from exactly where you are, with exactly what you have. I was using the blueprint. The room just couldn't see it yet. If you are in a room right now that looks to the people around you like a room with nothing in it, if you are in the guest version of your life, in the in-between, in the part that reads from the outside like stalling, but that you know, in the early mornings and the late evenings when you are alone with it, is actually the most important work you have ever done. I want to say this to you as directly as I know how to say it. Keep going, not because it is guaranteed to produce the phone call on the Easter table. There are no guarantees, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. Keep going because the work itself is the thing. Because the 140 pages exist whether or not Rosalind Park calls on a Sunday afternoon. Because your grandmother's blueprint, the specific, irreducible knowledge of how to build from where you are is yours, and it does not require anyone else's validation to be real. The room will catch up, or it won't. Either way, you will have made something true, and true things last longer than the opinions of rooms. If this story reached you tonight, if you are in the middle of something that the people around you don't have the context to understand yet, if you're building in private what you have not yet been able to say out loud, I want to hear from you. Tell me what you're working on. Tell me what the room doesn't know yet. Drop it in the comments. And if someone in your life is in their guest room right now, in their version of the in-between, doing work that nobody can see yet share this with them, let them know that someone else was there, and that it led somewhere, and that the doing of it was the thing that mattered all along. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next one.